Today's video is a combination of some of the worst cave diving tragedies that I have covered on this channel, to drowning in a freezing waterfall, being lost in the dark, or simply choking from no oxygen. We go through it all. Hit that like and subscribe button, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. In a small town in North Wales, one of the most historical and beautiful countries in the world, lies an old abandoned slate mine called Aberloss. Working men forced to abandon their livelihood because of a flood. Caves, both dry and fully submerged in water, that were unexplored, creating an exhilarating adventure for those daring enough to enter. But not all return home. The three men that entered the mine that day were part of the UK Mine and Cave Diving Exploration Group, but the Aberloss Slate Mine would change their lives forever. This is their story. Dry caving and cave diving both come with their own specific risks, and many people become experts at one or the other, but very few are great at both. While cave diving, you have a very specific set of equipment that is required to be underwater in the pitch black. Cave diving often seems the more extreme of the two similar activities because of the inherent risks of the cave, combined with being underwater, breathing a complex mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen called trimix. Divers have to adjust the gas mixture depending on how deep they dive to prevent nitrogen narcosis. Not to be confused with decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis is the breathing of air under pressure that impacts how much the nitrogen molecules are dissolved into your tissues and blood. Too much extra nitrogen can affect the brain and cause an inebriated-like symptom, leaving the diver open to easy mistakes. Mistakes that can and will cost your life. While some dry cavers may shy away from these risks, their chosen hobby is still not the safest way to spend your free time. Some caves are more harmless than others due to the large passages and being short in nature, but other, deeper caves that contain tight restrictions are inherently more dangerous. A restriction is a small space that a person can squeeze their body through. In dry caving, these restrictions can go on for a few feet to hundreds of feet. Imagine lying on your stomach, unable to move your arms and legs up or down, while you wiggle your body forward inch by inch, feeling the pressure of the rock on your spine and in your stomach. This is not for the faint of heart, or those that suffer from claustrophobia. Not to mention, some dry caves have a risk of flooding, and you do not want to be trapped hundreds of feet under the surface with gallons of water roaring at you. In the UK, there are groups of experienced individuals that take on caving as a hobby, and for the more advanced, they look forward to the few opportunities that pop up in their lifetime. Mapping an unexplored cave. While dry caving and cave diving both carry their own risks, mapping an unknown cave can lead to increasing the possibility of something going wrong, since you are plunging into the darkness with no idea what is ahead of you. This can lead to incredible discoveries and sights, but it makes mapping and traversing these areas difficult, as hauling enough gear around for both diving and dry caving is extremely tedious. On top of that, there's always the risk of air pockets through a cave containing harmful gases. Just because an area of a cave is dry does not mean the air is safe to breathe, as sometimes there is no way clean oxygen can reach the pockets below the earth. On August 23, 2014, Will Smith, Darcy Foley, and Sasha London entered the Aberloss abandoned slate mine, as they had done the month before and the month before that. They were a part of the UK Mine and Cave Diving Exploration Group and were mapping out the unexplored mine. The three men were experienced divers in their late 30s and early 40s with hundreds of dives under their belts. These were not your average explorers. Will Smith was one of the founding members of the group, which was created to connect like-minded people who had a love for adventure and exploration. This is what drove them all. So when Will discovered the Aberloss mine, he thought it was the perfect place for the group to explore. While originally a working slate mine, over the years it had been abandoned and flooded, causing some areas to collapse. The landscape was vastly different from when it was an operating mine, thus causing it to be unexplored and unmapped, an exciting opportunity for the 3 experienced divers. They had been mapping different areas of the cave once a month for the last year and a half and were very familiar with particular areas of the mine, but there was still a great amount that had yet to be seen. Their goal in August 2014 was to reach a dry area of the cave 1,000 feet from the entrance to continue mapping that area they had already previously explored. The mine was thought to be around 1,900 feet, but they were not completely sure as any old map was unreliable. So as they arrived at the entrance, and like the months before, Will Smith began going over the dive plan with the other members. They had brought 12 canisters of gas and would be staging them along the route as there was a worry that certain areas of the cave had poisonous air. Another key risk while under the water was the enormous amount of mining equipment littered throughout the route. This was one of the reasons they were here, to document the many spades, picks, lanterns, infrastructure, and decomposing explosives that was encapsulated underwater as if they were entering a time machine every time they entered the mine. This was history. After the trio were comfortable with what was to come over the coming hours, they grabbed their gear and began the long trek down the first passage to enter the water. They lugged over 100 pounds of gear and gas canisters. Their heavy breaths labored in the dark cave, lit by their headlamps, eventually reaching the edge of the water and without a second thought, walking in, putting in their regulators, and submerging themselves into the dark. They made quick work swimming through the passages, as they knew them pretty well, each movement extremely precise. With cave diving, you use short, powerful kicks that do not extend very far past your hips, called frog kicks, so that silt sitting on the bottom of the cave is not affected as you pass through. One wrong kick would erupt a cloud of dust all around them, making it virtually impossible to see a few feet in front of you. It is not an entirely beautiful dive, as it is muddy, dark water, but it is littered with amazing pieces of history. It was beautiful in its own way, and a peaceful experience for the professional divers. As they swam through the main passage, they could not help but feel overwhelmed, as everywhere they looked was a black void leading in a different direction. Left, right, up, down, all potential passages to explore, but none of them particularly inviting. Being experienced, they ignored the temptation on their shoulder and followed the route that had already been explored, which was part of the main passage that stretched for most of the mine. This is why it had taken over a year and a half of diving to lay the line and arrows amongst the rocks and equipment below them. A dive line is a thin but strong piece of rope that follows the path of the cave. It is one of the key rules of cave diving. Always use a line, as should there be any emergency, such as a silt out, there would be a way to exit the cave. They slowly progress with slow kicks, their lights bobbing in the pitch black, broken by the occasional ladder or minecart in front of them. Soon enough, they had reached the unexplored area and surfaced through a nearly vertical shaft into dry air. Will had already explored similar passages along the route and had a feeling it would lead to an adit entrance. An adit is used in mining as a small ventilation and emergency exit leading from the mine directly to the surface. These are typically tight passages that had over time collapsed due to the no upkeep. The plan was for Will to get out of the water and explore the passage, while Sasha and Darcy stayed on the edge of the water, resupplying and waiting for Will to return. If it ended up being a larger cave system, Will would regroup and they would explore and map the cave together. So they watched as Will exited the water, leaving his regulator in his mouth, and he began walking down the tight path. He looked rather odd, walking through the cave with his tank still firmly on his back and his fins on his feet, almost like a duck walking into a dark void alone. The passage they had emerged in was a sharp incline, almost like a stairway, and Will was slowly making his way up. The water extended vertically below them into the void. Will moved slowly, as he could not risk breathing in the air because of the potential poisonous gases in the mine. But after moving a few feet, he noticed something odd about his gas cylinder. Sasha and Darcy were checking their own equipment at the edge of the water, but noticed a headlight shine directly at them. As they slowly looked up the sharp incline, they were initially blinded, as if staring directly into the sun. They shielded their eyes with their hands and noticed Will was pointing at his cylinders and looked uneasy. He made out a couple of words. "There is a problem with my gas." Then his eyes rolled back into his head and Will tumbled down the slope, smack into the water, creating an awful echo sound similar to a body falling on rock. Will had been breathing the air in the cavern, and he was right. It was poisonous. The air in the chamber was a strong mixture of carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, accumulating from the leftover mining equipment and decaying explosives that could not reach clean air. Sasha and Darcy immediately jumped into action, pulling Will's heavy body bogged down by pounds of equipment from the water. He was already unconscious, and he was not breathing. Sasha tried shoving his spare regulator into Will's mouth, but his jaw was ironed shut. They did the only thing they could and started CPR, but there was no way to get clean air into him. It only took a minute, but they realized their leader and good friend would not wake up. Will was gone, but Sasha and Darcy had to make a decision, and they had to do it quickly, as staying in the passage could lead to neither of them making it out alive. They had to decide whether to leave Will's body in the cave or try to bring him back to the surface. They would not be able to haul him out safely, so with heavy hearts, they laid him down on the rock and submerged themselves into the water. They began making their way out of the mine, following the route they had entered, but with only two. As Will's body lay alone in the cave, Sasha and Darcy slowly made their way back to safety. They swam in tandem, not able to fully grasp what had just happened. They swam in shock, only worrying about their own safety. Even an experienced diver could succumb to the emotional burden of losing a friend. They would eventually reach the exit in the early afternoon, emerging from the water into the dry cave. The smell of fresh air hit them like a tidal wave washing over their bodies. They finally had a moment to grieve their friend in the dark. Nothing would ever be the same. They made an emergency call, and North Wales Cave Rescue Organization and the Northeast Wales Search and Rescue Team would be on site later that day. There was one problem. Nobody knew the exact reason for Will's death, and the team was weary of rushing into the cave without knowing what they were getting into. They thought it was a simple equipment failure, but they weren't certain. Nonetheless, in the early hours of the morning on August 24th, the team entered the mine, and later that day emerged with Will's body so that his family could put him to rest. They also retrieved all of the diving equipment and realized that everything was working as intended, but there was one problem. Will's 1-liter canister was out of gas. The abandoned mine was closed shut after Will's death, as it was deemed too dangerous for explorers because of the toxic gas from the rotting equipment, but would eventually be reopened due to the pressure from the UK Mining and Cave Diving Exploration Group. Over the next year, the full 1,961 feet would be mapped, with the second level of 984 feet just below the main passage. They achieved the goal that their leader had set for the group, completed it in honor of their fallen friend. Florida, a state covered in long, beautiful beaches, warm weather, and many tourists. But hidden in its depths are underwater caverns that are mysterious yet beautiful for all who dare to enter. It's no surprise that cave diving runs rampant throughout the entire state as divers flock from around the world to visit and explore its wonder. There is a very rich history filled with exploration, advancement, and of course, tragedy. For two Florida college students in July of 1992, they would quickly find out the terror lurking below the surface. This is their story. Located in Alachua, Florida, one would find Alachua Sink, which was renamed to the Mill Creek Sink in 2003 due to another sink taking the Alachua name, but many divers and locals still refer to it as its original namesake. You see, the system has a rich history for cave divers. Under this sinkhole is the only known access point to the underground Mill Creek stream. The sink resides at the bottom of a 50-foot, nearly vertical cliff edge. It is an intense sight as debris of fallen trees and bushes leave the water at the surface a constant, murky green color. It does not look appealing or inviting, but never judge a book by its cover, as when a diver leaves Mill Creek Sink and enters Mill Creek Stream, the water begins to clear out and eventually revealing a beautiful cave system. It was first explored by some of the most famous cave divers in the world, Sheck Exley and Court Smith, where the original survey map was drawn and published for other divers. The first test of the sink would simply be accessing the water, as in the 1980s, divers would tie a rope around a nearby tree to rappel into the sink with over 100 pounds of gear on their backs. Once one enters the water, they would have to descend to 130 feet before hitting the bottom. Here, the main cave system splits into two tunnels. One leads against the flow upstream, and the other with the flow downstream. Visibility can be extremely poor based on the weather conditions and how much debris may have fallen into the sink. Divers may need to wait a few days for water visibility to improve depending on the conditions. Even on good days, it typically will not improve until the diver enters a downstream or upstream tunnel. Each pathway contains various caverns that can have depths as deep as 227 feet. Diving below roughly 20 to 30 feet greatly increases the risk of the exploration for inexperienced divers, as decompression stops are needed to expel dissolved nitrogen in the diver's bloodstream as they surface. Failing to do so would bring on the bends, which can be painful and in extreme cases lead to death. Because of this, and the extremely low visibility throughout the cave, the dive is deathly dangerous. Simply losing the line could very easily lead to a catastrophic situation. This is why the cave is recommended only for truly experienced divers, and today you would have to have a guide along with over 100 cave dives post-certification to even be considered to enter. These rules were established after 1992, mostly because of the story that I have for you today, which takes place in July of that same year. Lance Crawford was a 23-year-old University of Florida agriculture student. He always enjoyed exploring the outdoors, as he obtained his cave diving certification a month earlier and was very eager to explore the underwater caves. Lance had heard about the Mill Creek Sink and the challenges it posed and felt like it was calling to him. He knew it would physically challenge him, something he was always looking for. He was known to partake in activities like skydiving and shark hunting, so it's no surprise that Lance would develop an interest in cave diving. On July 24th, Lance and an unnamed friend would both drive down to Mill Creek Sink with the intention of reaching Mill Creek Stream. All articles have excluded Lance's diving partner's identity, so for the sake of this story, we will call the unnamed friend John. Now, John was also a certified cave diver, but like Lance, has only had his certification for about a month. It didn't take long for the duo to find the sink and lug their gear 50 feet down a steep incline, which had to be done by tying a rope to a tree and slowly lowering oneself. Stars lit up the night sky as the clock told them it was a little past 9 p.m. As both divers entered the water, they noticed the poor conditions, as it had been raining recently, and the water visibility was worse than normal, as they could only see about 6 inches in front of them. Understandably, John was hesitant to even start the dive, as something just felt off. The conditions were poor, he was not as excited as Lance, and when it came down to it, he just did not feel safe. They both knew they were underexperienced for this cave, as the ground did have a warning sign. But Lance was beaming with excitement as the anticipation of what lay underneath was fast approaching. He enjoyed diving more than most and looked forward to the challenge. Despite the conditions, Lance had a careless attitude, like he almost did not believe that what he was about to attempt was even dangerous to begin with. So, with a few quick words and a little reluctance from John, both divers would slide on their masks and submerge themselves. It's important to note that a dive line normally is not set up at the entrance of a cave. This is to make sure recreational divers do not enter a cave by carelessness. However, for the Mill Creek sink, a dive line is almost mandatory to even begin the dive due to the visibility. Once Lance and John had submerged, they identified where the dive line was and began to follow it deep into the depths. After moving down the first room, the duo would have entered a 300 to 400 foot wide open room called Crawfish Heaven. But as John and Lance continued, the visibility only got worse. So bad that they still had not been able to see the walls that surrounded them. With only a few minutes into the dive, John was having serious doubts. The risks were extremely high with no sign of reprieve. He honestly had no desire to continue and did not see a point in pushing himself further. Now, it's unclear exactly the position that Lance and John were both located at this moment. It is almost not clear if they were on the same guideline. But what is clear is that both divers were near each other, with John either ahead of Lance or on a separate line. John, feeling really uneasy at this point about the dive and continuing, would turn to locate Lance. But again, the visibility was so poor, it was challenging to keep sight of each other. When John turned back to look for Lance, he could not spot him. And already nervous, John knew that he had to try to remain calm, which was challenging because deep down John was panicking. Nevertheless, John quit moving deeper into the cave. He grasped the water all around him, searching for a sign from Lance. Over and over his hands would extend, but every time they would return with nothing. John was careful and meticulous in order to not silt out the water even further, but with the current visibility, it was almost impossible to not make a mistake. John did not know at the time how long he had been searching for Lance, but would later find out he had spent over an hour searching through the silt, barely able to see his hands reaching out in front of him. Eventually, he began to think of himself. Frustrated and scared, John turned himself around with the help of the guideline and began to slowly swim back to the surface. All while doing so, he kept a vigilant eye out for Lance, feeling in all directions as far as his arms would extend. It did not take long for him to resurface, as they had not ventured too far into the cave. Once he was above water, John quickly got out of the sink and took a moment to examine the water. He was looking for bubbles, any sign of air escaping that could have been coming from Lance's oxygen tanks. But just like under the surface, he saw nothing. John was beginning to lose hope, and the realization of the situation began to hit him as his stomach turned over with dread. The Alachua police were contacted and informed of the situation, and they would then call on the cave diver recovery team at Jenny Springs to assist. A team of 10 highly experienced cave divers would immediately respond to the call. It would take some time to get all their equipment, so the sink would constantly be monitored in case Lance did resurface. But as the night continued, the mood became more grim. If Lance somehow did survive, he should have resurfaced by now, and along with the fact that no air bubbles have been spotted, their chances were dwindling. Led by Jared Jablonski, all 10 divers would enter the water at 8 a.m. Saturday morning, almost 11 hours after Lance and John had originally entered the sink. The entire day was spent looking for any sign of Lance, but there was none. Progress was gruelingly slow for everyone, as divers struggled to venture far due to the visibility being so poor. There was a slight rainfall, which fed even more debris into the sink, making the rescue more dangerous than it already was. One could only see about a foot in front of themselves in the murky water. This process would continue over the next few days in a painfully slow manner for all those who anxiously waited to hear about Lance. The Mill Creek sink's conditions would not improve through the search, almost like the sink was antagonizing everyone searching on purpose. With each passing day, the expectation of a body recovery becoming the primary concern. In total, 50 divers would help with the search, which would continue to span over the weekend and into the following week. When Monday came around, morale was at an all-time low, and the team had been searching for about 2.5 days now, and there had been no sign of Lance. All news outlets at this point were reporting that Lance was most likely dead inside of the cave. Around 6 p.m., a diver was searching along the wall in the Crawfish Heaven room when he noticed that right about the 50-meter mark was an indentation in the wall forming a lip formation. It was there that Lance Crawford was found. The scene was painful to find and diagnose, as it was clear Lance had struggled until his last breath. All of his gear was still attached, although his mouthpiece was not in his mouth. From where his body was positioned, it was apparent that Lance was looking for the exit but had no visibility of the cave. He would have been in a state of panic with adrenaline pumping through his veins, frantically looking for a way out as he crawled along the wall with no guideline. With the small indentations along the walls and under the right circumstances, one could easily mistake the lip formation as an opening, which most likely is what Lance did. And in his panic, with no visibility, he managed to wedge himself in this lip formation, thinking it would continue forward. But the restriction only got tighter and tighter with no way out. Lance's body was stuck fairly deep into the wedge, so he could not be easily removed, and ultimately, his death would be ruled a drowning. It would take divers working through the night before they finally managed to remove Lance's body. Due to his location, there was not a lot of space to maneuver for more than a couple of rescue divers. Combine that with the visibility issue, and it's no surprise that the recovery took so long. He would not resurface until midday on Tuesday, only further highlighting the challenges that the rescue team faced. This story is dedicated to Lance Crawford's memory and what we can learn from his experience, the importance of taking every dive seriously, not to push yourself past high-risk conditions, and to always listen to your gut. It's hard to say if Lance could have done something different to save himself underwater, but it is clear if Lance and John both were more experienced, they would not have attempted to dive Mill Creek Sink in such horrible conditions, and they both would have survived that night of terror. Jackson Blue. There is something about this Florida paradise, whether it's the rich history, gorgeous water, or the flock of people that enjoy the area each summer, year after year. But like most Florida paradises, there are two words that put a pit in our stomachs. For some of us, it's fear, and others, it's excitement. Cave diving. The signs are littered throughout the grounds and is home to the successful Cave Adventure shop. Yet throughout its history, it has not escaped its share of tragedy. This is one of those stories. For those immersed in the cave diving world, Jackson Blue is a common name and one of the most active cave diving places today for good reason. It is an absolutely beautiful dive with several offshoots from the main line to keep divers coming back again and again. It is located in the northern part of Florida, just south of the Alabama and Georgia border, where the water hovers around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a staple for the Florida caves. While open year-round for divers, it is available for other activities such as swimming, snorkeling, or just a relaxing outdoor trip during the summer months. If you ever find your way to Jackson Blue, you will find the home shop for Cave Adventures, one of the staple cave diving shops in the country, as it was founded by legendary diver Ed Sorensen, who has his own history of diving unmapped caves and, of course, rescue dives. To dive the hole today would require registration through his shop, and it is a common place for training or obtaining your certification. Even in 1999, cave diving was common there, although not as common as today. Yet in the late 90s, you would still have to be a certified diver and register with the local sheriff's office before granted access. Stephen Wixon, a 33-year-old Alabama native, traveled to Florida with his two unnamed friends for a quick getaway with the intention of diving the famous and beautiful Jackson Blue. All articles have excluded Stephen's dive partners' names for privacy. For the sake of this story, we will refer to Stephen's friends as Dennis and Michael. All three men were certified cave divers and known in the local area as great divers. By all measures, they were qualified to enter the inner depths of Jackson Blue in the early hours of the morning on Sunday, April 18, 1999. The first few hundred feet of the cave are shallow, with a depth of 12 to 15 meters, which deepens to 27 meters in a short drop-off. The 27-meter depth is held throughout multiple different caverns, stretching for over 4,000 feet. Their plan was to reach the further areas of the cave, 3,000 feet plus. The water was a clear blue as they sat basking in the sunlight, going over their plan one last time. They could not help but start to feel the excitement building in each of their stomachs as their time drew closer and closer. Calm, yet smiles littered their faces. Then it was time, and so with everyone comfortable with their plan and their gear in order, the three men submerged themselves and entered the cave at roughly 9:30 a.m. Fallen trees and wildlife covered the outer areas of the hole, but as soon as they entered the cave, it was incredibly clear and visibility was fantastic, further building each of their excitements. It was a perfect day to dive. They made their way through the first few hundred feet easily and continued following the set dive line as they swam deeper into the depths of the cave. Because of the rich history within the walls, there was already a set line that stretched most of the cavern, while some areas would branch off into other routes that may have distracted or enticed less experienced divers. The three pros were stoic and remained set on their plan. They passed a few other groups of divers as they progressed through the caves, which was expected as today was the perfect day to dive, and there was plenty of space. Over an hour went by as they swam slowly, making progress through the caverns. The visibility continued to be great, and as they swam, they were careful not to stir up any silt on the floor. Some areas are a little bit of a squeeze, but for most of the dive, it is a breeze for the three experienced divers. They found themselves reaching the 3,000 foot mark with no issues at all, and all three members were calm. It was peaceful, at least for the three men under the surface. It was at this point that they encountered their first test. Whether it was a bad kick from a member or a careless group in front of them, we may never know. Yet after passing the 3,000 foot mark, the cave silted out, and fast. Visibility was perfect, then within seconds, visibility was zero, and the three men could not even see a few inches in front of them. This, of course, made it impossible to see where they were going, yet all three men were calm. This is when experience matters, and they knew panic could only lead one way. Steven was leading the group with Dennis and Michael behind him, and when the silt hit the three divers, they had a brief window of time where they could see each other, their faces distraught. This was the first moment all day that they began to feel unsettled. It was not a panic, but they started to feel their nerves being tested. Even a professional could not help but feel a little unsure. Although they were experienced divers, they did not know the cave like others, and with zero visibility, it would make diving the last 1,000 feet extremely difficult. Plus, increase the risk of the dive to a level that none of them were comfortable with. So within those few seconds, the decision was made to turn around, but visibility was only getting worse and spreading throughout the entire section of the cave they were in. It was almost like a domino effect. As soon as their ability to see became worse, it opened the door for more simple errors. A brush of the wall here, a wrong kick there, and the silt became worse and worse with no reprieve. The three men turned around, and at this point there was zero visibility. They could no longer see the dive line, but they knew where it was. So Dennis, Michael, and Steven began swimming in the area, their arms outstretched into the muck that surrounded them. They were grasping for the line, or anything that could help them determine where they were. Even for an experienced diver, it is difficult to remain calm in these scenarios, as all three men couldn't help but continue to feel the nerves build into a panic. Yet, they had no choice but to keep searching. They knew they were roughly in the right area, and when suddenly Dennis reached out, he felt it, the dive line. A wave of relief washed over him, and he quickly started following it out of the silt, which at this point was over 100 feet of the cave. Once his visibility started to improve, he felt more at ease, but was still waiting on his diving partners, and he watched as he saw a beam of light slowly exit the cloud of silt. It was Michael. He had made it to Dennis, where you could see the relief on both of their faces. This only lasted a second, as they waited for the last beam of light to appear through the wall of silt in front of them, but there was nothing. A minute went by, then 2, and still no sign of Steven. They were over an hour into the dive, so there was a strong sense of feeling alone. They still had plenty of air, but it would only last so long. They did the only thing they could, and they began to search for Steven. They carefully and slowly entered back into the silt, which still provided almost no visibility, but they knew exactly where they were now and could easily follow the dive line out. If they were less experienced, they may have never entered back into the silt, but they did so looking for their friend, a calm expression on their faces. Once again, they slowly reached out in all directions, while maintaining a feel for their dive line. For over half an hour, they occasionally felt the brush of the cave wall, the roof, and the rocks, but no sign of Steven. They had searched long enough to where the silt had started to clear, but they were running out of air quickly. They followed the rule of thirds for this exact situation, but were already well into their reserve air. A decision had to be made, and quickly. If they stayed, they would continue to risk their own safety, but if they left, they would be leaving a friend behind. It was an impossible decision that nobody should ever have to make. Yet, with heavy hearts, Dennis and Michael looked at each other and made the decision to turn around and start the long trip back to the exit, leaving Steven alone in the cave. On their way to the exit, they passed another group and shared the message of a missing diver, to which one of their members acted quickly and started searching the area as well. Michael and Dennis could only pray as they made their way back to the surface. Both of them knew that Steven would be losing air fast, and if he did not start making his way out of the cave very soon, he would not have enough to survive. Once Michael and Dennis reached the surface, they quickly called diving experts from their home, Montgomery, Alabama, along with notifying local officials who called in divers from Pensacola. It did not take long for expert divers to reach Jackson Blue and begin preparing to enter the cave. Yet there were lights that would appear from below a few times during their preparation, and they would all hold their breaths as divers would emerge from the water over and over, but not the one that they were looking for. And soon enough, everyone had exited the cave. Everyone except for one. A team of rescue divers entered the cave mid-afternoon, made up of a couple recreation divers and military divers. They each had an extra tank of air with them, as this was the standard, but also just in case if Steven was still alive. The visibility was fantastic at the entrance, and even further in the cave, there was almost no sign remaining of the intense silt that had spanned multiple caverns just hours previously. They made quick work through the caves and soon reached the 3,000-foot mark with ease, where they began their search, yet there was no sign of Steven. They slowly expanded their search and ventured down the multiple connecting caverns, each leading member breathing slow, anxiously looking for any sign. They could not help but feel a sense of dread, as they knew that they were looking for a body. Then they saw him. Steven was floating near the ceiling of the cave, motionless, and with his rebreather floating next to him. They were all calm and found what they had entered the cave for, yet still felt the wave of sadness wash over them. This was an experienced diver and a friend. It just wasn't supposed to end this way. Steven, with no visibility, had made his way into one of the connecting passages mistakenly, and had no chance at making it out, as he had no idea where he was or where the dive line could be laying. The rescue team made quick work of retrieving his body, and at 8:30 p.m., over 11 hours after the original 3 men entered the cave, the final member was brought out of the cavern. Steven's death was not a case of inexperience or someone who shouldn't have been there. It was an accident from an extremely capable diver. It is a testament that even though you follow all the rules and the procedures, it does not mean that you will always feel the warmth of the sun when you enter a cave. There are a few hobbies in the world that invoke the emotions of cave diving. For the small community that loves to dive, it is an escape and a sense of peace while under the water, traveling through a piece of time that few people will ever see. For those of us on the outside looking in, it is fear, confusion, and a downright overwhelming conviction to never partake in this particular hobby. Yet there is something about the sport that is downright fascinating. Through history, there have been many divers in caves that were explored with their fair share of incredible stories and tragedies. Yet, where did this fascination begin? In 1955, a Navy lieutenant would enter Radium Springs cave system and be the first recorded cave diver to never see the light of day again. This is his story. Cave diving is still a relatively new hobby to those around the world, as it became popular in the US in the late 1950s and 60s, but was mostly reserved for the extremists, as it was seen as an extremely dangerous hobby by the general public. It wasn't until pioneers such as Sheck Exley and others began mapping and exploring caves that it was really seen as a desirable way to spend your free time. Plus, in the late 1950s, the required gear to cave dive was almost laughable, further building the rapport of early pioneers. While there are cases of free diving, or diving into a cave without a form of breathable air, the first cave dive occurred in 1943 by one of the co-founders of diving equipment, Jacques Vez-Costeu. He was also the first man to record a successful scuba and cave dive. So it was not a surprise that many early cave divers were comfortable with minimal gear, and the mistakes that were made throughout the years led to the development of many new procedures and equipment that is used today. Lieutenant Murray Anderson was a 28-year-old experienced skin diver with over 200 hours of experience underwater. A skin diver is someone who would snorkel on the surface and dive into the depths for a short time, similar to free diving. Although Anderson was known more so for skin diving as a leader in the Macon, Georgia Skin Diving Club, he was a Navy frogman and still had some experience as a cave diver. On the evening of May 14, 1955, Anderson was preparing to dive into the Radium Springs Cave in Georgia, a cave that he was helping map along with his best friend and fellow club member, Donald Garreau. Radium Springs is a Georgia icon, as it is the largest natural spring in the entire state. The water is striking blue, unmistakable for those above that were visiting the resort and casino. Yet under the surface is a small passage that a diver would have to squeeze through for a few feet before it opens into a vast underwater cave. The entire cave is a honeycomb structure, with some areas having over 25 to 30 different passages, some of them small dead ends, while others connect to other areas of the cave, creating an underwater maze stretching for over 1,532 feet. The caves are closed off today, with only a select few divers permitted access over the last few years, strictly for research and documentation purposes. Even when the cave is opened up today, divers are usually permitted to only travel up to a couple hundred feet before turning around, as the restrictions and honeycombs become more tense. There is a set dive line at the entrance of the cave, stretching for 200 feet simply for this purpose. The state of Georgia sees the underwater maze as too dangerous for recreational divers, as even experienced explorers could easily become lost or turn around in the system. Yet in 1955, only a few people even knew what lay under the surface of the spring. Yet the two friends were there to explore and map the cave, and they planned on entering the cave together, but it was common for them to explore different passages while both were in the cave to cover more ground and lay dive lines. While a dive line was still used, it did not carry the same urgency as it does today, with many divers straying from the line to explore connecting passages. Anderson and Donald were preparing to enter the cave through the 3-foot restriction on the bottom of the spring. They did not have permission to dive into the cave, and therefore were on edge as they got ready, quickly putting on their gear as soon as they arrived, praying that nobody would be there to witness them and question what they were doing. But they were not so lucky to have someone interrupt them, as that may have changed the events of the day. It was time, and with a smile on their faces, they pulled their homemade masks over their eyes, along with putting their regulators into their mouth before submerging into the spring. Anderson was using a homemade diving rig that had oxygen tanks strapped to his back. He had used the rig multiple times before, as purchasing full diving equipment was extremely expensive for recreational divers. They took a breath and swam through the clear blue water down to the 3-foot cave entrance, squeezing their bodies through the restriction and reaching the first opening of the cave system. The sunlight radiated off their backs above them, and then it was gone. Anderson and Donald were calm, yet excited like most divers, and they had been waiting hours for this moment and couldn't help but feel the emotions start to build. Yet like any athlete, once they entered the cave, it was game time. They laid the dive line in the sediment-filled floor below them. While some areas of the cave were larger than others, There are tight passages throughout, making it very easy to silt out the cave with one wrong kick. The system has a large amount of sediment on the walls and floors, more than usual, so one small mistake could easily reduce a diver's visibility from a few feet to merely inches, something they were both fully aware of and were careful as they slowly moved through the passages. Everything was going great as Anderson and Donald were making quick work through the first few hundred feet, and it was pretty simple. There was a few tight passages, but nothing that would be concerning. Donald was leading the group while he laid the line, and Anderson was a good distance back as he took his time through the cave, exploring the small offshoots that led to dead ends as he progressed. Donald had reached the 200-foot mark and was preparing to turn around as visibility had continued to worsen throughout the passages. He was also worried about exploring the cave any further, as at the 200-foot mark is a large room stretching 300 feet wide, 150 feet long, and at a depth of 80 feet. There was a honeycomb structure of passages in all directions with over 35 different choices. They had been in the cave for over 30 minutes, and to Donald, that was enough. As he was leaving, Anderson passed him, still swimming forward, and entered one of the small 3-foot wide restrictions. Anderson was known for leaving the dive line, and it had never been a problem for him as he just followed the same path back towards the exit. His friends knew that this was the way he liked to dive, because he could move through the caverns quicker, and they thought nothing of it as he was a great diver. So it was no surprise that at the end of the 200-foot guideline, Anderson kept swimming with no pause. He was swimming with a smile on his face and no guideline under him. There were over 35 different passages in front of him, striking a similar resemblance to a honeycomb from a bee's hive. But he was confident, and he began to swim down the first passage as Donald returned back to the surface. Anderson did not know it at the time, but there was only one passage that does not lead to a dead end, yet he continued to explore. He became more frustrated each time he explored a new offshoot, only to be greeted by a restriction too tight for a human body. This frustration led to a need to find a way through, but visibility had continued to worsen as Donald had left, to the point where he could only see about 6 inches in front of him. But he knew that he still had a little time left and was determined to find a new passage, and so he began exploring again, and this would be his final passage before he would have to return home. So frustrated and praying for a different result from the few passages he had already gone down, he began swimming through the muck. And as he swam forward, he was still calm, but he began to feel a little stress. Maybe Donald was right. Maybe it was time to go. It was time to turn around. And so, defeated and with a frown on his face, Anderson began swimming back the way he came. He was heartbroken, yet still felt some relief that he was going home. Then, there was darkness. Anderson stopped swimming in place, suddenly surrounded by nothing but black. There was a sudden rush of fear in the back of his throat, and then panic. He began hitting his flashlight with his hand, hoping to see any form of light. It was a homemade flashlight, just like his other gear, but he did not have an extra. It just would not turn back on, and Anderson was in a full panic mode. He couldn't accept this, and did the only thing he could. He kept swimming, occasionally bumping the wall of the cave. There was no way out of the honeycomb maze, if only he had a dive line. Donald sat on the surface of the spring. It had been over an hour, and Anderson should have surfaced by now. He had been worried for the last 20 minutes, but now he was sure he had to do something. This was not like the Anderson he knew. It was dark outside when help arrived. It was Anderson's fellow club members and fellow divers, Jim Britton and an unnamed diver, and Donald teamed up with the other two, and the three of them re-entered the Radium Springs cave in the dead of night. They made quick work through the cave, but visibility was horrid. They could only see a few inches in front of their faces, yet they started searching at the end of the 200-foot dive line. They were their friend's last hope. A couple hours passed by, and the group of three were still grasping for anything. They continuously reached their hands out over and over through the silt, but again and again, each passage presented no results. If they stayed any longer, they would risk their own safety, and so with heavy hearts, all three members turned around, defeated. All three were tired, but Donald had the worst of it. He was exhausted after he reached the surface, barely with enough strength to even pull himself out of the water with the gear on his back. His breath was labored and his eyes sunken. He always had hope, but admitting defeat sucked everything from him. He couldn't accept that his best friend was gone. This was no longer a rescue. but a body recovery. A Navy team was flown in the following day from Charleston, South Carolina to help with the body recovery. And on Sunday morning, one day after Anderson had entered the cave, they prepared to go into the maze. Hundreds of people watched from the hotel and casino just above the spring, as nobody had ever heard of a tragedy such as this. They couldn't believe that someone was willing to go into an underwater cave. Visibility for the rescue team was fantastic, and they could see for several feet through the unmistakable blue water. Only 30 minutes after entering the cave, they had reached the 200-foot mark, and they saw him. Anderson was floating near the roof of the cave, his body still, as if frozen in time as the water moved around him. His regulator was no longer in his mouth, and his flashlight dangled around him. The dive line lay just a few feet below him. Donald and the other 2 Macon Diving Club members had swam under Anderson the night before several times, but since the cavern was so large, along with the poor visibility, they never knew. They had searched for hours, and he was only a few feet above them. The rescue team pulled Anderson from the cave at roughly 8 a.m. on Monday 15th, so his friends and family could say their goodbyes. His death led to a lot of changes in the diving community, as it was the first publicized death in the United States, and being a 28-year-old Navy frogman only led to the push for change. It was an imperative lesson in the creation of cave diving rules, such as always using a dive line, having 3 flashlights, and the rule of thirds. Although his death was a tragic event that was published around the country through many newspapers, it adapted modern diving today. Radium Springs Cave never recovered, and this tragedy is a big reason why the caves are still closed to this day for recreational divers. It is an attempt to prevent the fate of a young 28-year-old from ever reoccurring through the community.